Thank you very much, Tobias. And good afternoon, good evening, good morning for those who are connected in other time zones. Thank you for joining us at this meeting today. I am Anna Albazzi del Frate. I am the chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. This is the umbrella organization that includes all NGOs interested in supporting the UN program on crime prevention and criminal justice, as well as the two international crime treaties, the UNTOC, which includes the UN protocol on firearms, the Firearm Protocol, and UNCAC. We joined forces with the Osservatorio sulla Criminalità Organizzata, CROSS, to organize this event on comparing global arms control instruments review processes, lessons and challenges. The objective of this side event is to take stock broadly of the review processes of the main global small arms control instruments, focusing on the connections between the implementation and monitoring processes of these instruments and how they might better support each other. We are very grateful to Italy and Mexico, who have kindly agreed to sponsor this event. And I am pleased that we have an impressive group of speakers today. I would like to start immediately with giving the floor to two speakers who will share their own impressive expertise, but also the point of view of their respective member states, Italy and Mexico. And I give the floor to Antonio Balsamo, who has recently been appointed as the president of the Tribunal of Palermo. So congratulations, Dr. Balsamo. And previously, he was for many years advisor to the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations in Vienna. Dr. Balsamo, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much, Madam Chair, also for your kind words. It is a great honor for me to take part in this meeting, and I am very happy to speak to you from Palermo, where it all started. I believe that meetings like this are very useful for building a synergy between international fora, such as New York and Vienna, and practitioners operating at a national level in contexts like mine in Palermo, as regards strengthening the fight against some of the most dangerous and widespread forms of organized crime, such as the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking firearms, their parts and components and ammunition. According to prominent scholars, the Firearms Protocol, adopted 20 years ago, is currently the most important international instrument of a universal nature in this field. It deals with one of the most profitable markets for transnational organized crime, with a criminal phenomenon that generates high costs in terms of lives, causes serious damage to the democratic stability of states, and has a significant impact on the maintenance of international peace and security. The increase in the number of murders committed by criminal organizations, the ethnic conflicts that have broken out in specific regional contexts, the development of the terrorist threat are all factors that have increased the level of concern about this issue. To address this phenomenon in the more general context of the fight against transnational organized crime, the United Nations adopted in 2001 the Firearms Protocol, which supplements the Palermo Convention. A strong focus on the link between illicit trafficking in firearms, other forms of transnational organized crime, such as drug trafficking, and money laundering channels, was also present in the investigations conducted by Giovanni Falcone, a man whose work and sacrifice paved the way to the Palermo Convention and its protocols, as highlighted in an important resolution adopted by the last conference of parties to the UNTOC, Giovanni Falcone, underlined that the arms trade is a clear demonstration of the ever closer ties between the various criminal organizations, which have enormously increased their power and therefore their social dangerousness, precisely through mutual alliances. The most recent investigation fully confirmed these key findings. Undoubtedly, some recent developments may lead to great progress in increasing the effectiveness of the UNTOC and its firearms protocol, which have played a key role in promoting the strengthening of international cooperation, as well as the development of adequate legal frameworks and effective criminal justice responses at the domestic level. As you all know, after years of disagreements, the Conference of the Parties to the UNTOC finally established a review mechanism to the Convention and its protocols in 2018. From Italy's point of view, its main value added will consist of 3 points. First, promoting the exchange of up-to-date information and independent expert analysis, which can effectively support states in decision-making about evidence-based policies for the implementation of the UNTOC and its protocols. Secondly, assessing the Convention's relevance and its impact in connection to contemporary crime trends. Thirdly, circulating community-based responses to criminal phenomena. We are confident that the review mechanism will strengthen the effectiveness of the Palermo Convention and its protocols by strengthening international cooperation, also as a result of a greater harmonization of domestic legal systems. In recent years in Italy, there have been new dynamics directed towards the adoption of advanced models of judicial cooperation. And among the recent developments, whose circulation can be facilitated by the review mechanism, I would like to mention 2 experiences that are particularly valuable. The first one is the use of the Palermo Convention as a legal basis for the enforcement of non-conviction-based confiscation in other states. This kind of confiscation has been described recently by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe as the most realistic way for states to tackle the financial power of organized crime in order to defend democracy and the rule of law. In my opinion, it is a very important tool against the economic dimension of the illicit manufacturing of and trafficking in firearms. And the second example is the deployment of liaison magistrates. The starting point was the deployment of a Nigerian senior prosecutor to Italian prosecution offices, supported by UNODC in the context of a project funded by Italy and the Netherlands, which aimed to address the crimes of smuggling of migrants and human trafficking. The Nigerian prosecutor, which I had the honor to meet, has been able not only to facilitate international judicial cooperation, but also to provide many Italian magistrates with an in-depth knowledge of the roots of this criminal phenomena. In my opinion, this form of advanced cooperation could be extended to several other areas of crime. The effective implementation of UNTOC and its protocols is all the more important at a time when the nexus between transnational organized crime and firearm trafficking has become more evident. And we are also confident that the implementation of the review mechanism will lay the ground for a constructive dialogue with the civil society. In Italy, the establishment of the review mechanism in the 2018 and its launch in 2020 have generated renewed interest in the convention, not only among public authorities, but also in civil society and academia. As a matter of fact, several Italian NGOs participated in the last conference of the parties to the UNTOC. And by the way, some of them, namely the Falcone Foundation, Libera, and the Pio La Torre Study Center, are headquartered in buildings confiscating from mafia-type organizations, which operated also in the area of firearm trafficking. The commitment of academia is highlighted by the meaningful activity of the Cross Center in Milan. And I am very grateful to Professor Christian Ponti for his contribution to our work. The review mechanism offers an opportunity to engage better with the civil society at two different stages. First, during the country review, that is when a state responds to the questionnaires and is reviewed by two other states parties. And let me say that we have included several members of the academia in the list of Italian experts for the review mechanism. Secondly, during the general review, under the auspices of the conference of the parties and the constructive dialogue envisaged to take place in the context of the working group. I believe that UNODC has an important role in this regard because it is very relevant to raise awareness among NGOs, both those which are already familiar with the UN processes and the smaller ones, which are particularly active at the local level. As member states, we should seize this opportunity and benefit as much as possible during the implementation of the mechanism from the contribution of civil society, which can provide an external multidisciplinary viewpoint to supplement the primarily legal focus of the review mechanism. Thank you very much for your strong commitment, Madam Chair. We will benefit greatly from it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it's really a pleasure to hear such a connection between the work that you are doing and the role that you see for civil society. I know that many of our members are following closely and promoting the engagement of civil society in review mechanisms, and they will be very pleased with your remarks. Thank you very much. And I would like now to give the floor to Isaac Morales, who is really an expert we have seen in many occasions. And thank you for being here. He is the coordinator for multidimensional security from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Isaac Morales, the floor is yours, please.
Oh, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, Anna. First, let me, on behalf of the government of Mexico, express our gratitude to all organizers, to all panelists, to joining efforts to have such a timely and plural side event, despite the complications that actually we all are facing with the pandemic or because of the pandemic. The double 20th anniversary of the POA and the UNTOC protocol brings an excellent occasion to reaffirm how, through multilateralism, we can address together governments, civil society, academia, private sectors, all relevant actors, to address one of the other pandemics, the one of the violence, homicides, attacks, and crimes around the world where arms and ammunition are clearly the material enablers. It is also proper moment to identify and face the obstacles to the universal and more effective implementation. 20 years ago, we were sure to reach a prompt and effective implementation of each of the instruments worldwide. But now the reality presents to us new challenges and the need to at least renovated commitments. Great news come when at the multilateral level, of course, we are able to reach consensus or agreements on common basis to prevent and counter a phenomenon such as the diversion and trafficking of small arms and ammunition. But that is only, if I may say, the half of the work, because we do need to implement and to open pathways to put into practice those commitments. Here is where the most important value of review processes, follow-up mechanisms, monitoring efforts, and reporting commitments is visible. Many discussions you know very well have passed during the last months in New York, in Vienna, in Geneva, in many other sets during the last months and years, stressing the importance of the so-called whole view, of the need to address the whole life cycle of arms and ammunitions, and the relevance to address them in a comprehensive manner, to address arms and at the same time parts of them and ammunitions from a broader and comprehensive approach. The reality is that we haven't, at the multilateral level, such a unique instrument yet. Then, what we have are major commitments to work from concrete mandates and activities differentiated from POA, UNTOC, ATT, and even the Convention on Conventional Arms, for instance, or the regional instruments such as the CIFTA in the Americas. Just some months ago, in the Conference of States Parties of UNTOC, we adopted, with the same UN, we adopted a relevant resolution initially proposed by Mexico, which offered concrete and actually enthusiastic language on the relevance of synergies, the comprehensive view, the need to better reporting efforts and share experiences, the relevance of the UNTOC review processes, to say some elements. I cannot easily explain how, just some months later, we are still stuck in POA discussions, deciding if having or not having synergies as part of our results of the BMS. If ammunitions are part of the same conversation or are other kind of conversation. Or why not advancing more strong calls to implementation under the complementary approach? At least for Mexico, we see the same multilateral efforts, the same UN, the same countries discussing on the very same important phenomenon. Then we at least will be open, all delegations, to accept what we actually have accepted before. Let me just briefly share with you three general ideas on how I believe we can try to improve the implementation and how to pass the impasse. First, I believe it is important to look more closely to the human dimension of this phenomenon, taking into account, for instance, the victims approach, like we have to in other multilateral discussion. For the government of Mexico, this phenomenon, it is not only the tool. It is not only centered on the tool, I mean on the arms or the ammunition, nor in the offense, in the illicit, but on the whole view of the issue that illicit trafficking and diversion of arms trade continues day by day, negatively impacting the development of communities, their well-being, and the social fabric. The number of people who are victims daily of firearms violence around the world, even with the confinement derived from the pandemic, continues to increase. Then why not thinking, starting from now, on responsible responses to this, to somehow reparation to these victims? The second element is the need to incorporate better the legal, political, and technical discussion at the same time. We cannot have technical subgroups of each of our instruments and fora advancing very well on, for instance, reporting templates, and then passing to a more political discussions where simply cannot reach an agreement on what at the technical level we got. And in the end, on the discussion of the legal complementarity and mutually reinforcing views of those instruments, it is needed. Then, from the very beginning, it is important to keep in mind these three dimensions: the legal, the political, and the technical on their review processes. Finally, the third element is that it is important to incorporate better the illicit markets approach by recognizing that we are facing an increasing demand, an increasing offer, an increasing distribution by illicit means of arms and ammunition. It is not with the aim of pointing to producers, not the aim to pointing to those countries that are not that have not the capacity to manage the imports and exports, but to look at the acts, not the actors, to approach the market as a whole, and then to try to identify where our better responses to each of the stages of this market can be addressed. I will let here, and perhaps we can come back later, also sharing that Mexico recently, as chairing the CIFTA Consultative Committee, convened the very first informal discussion of all those governing bodies and secretariats of these instruments. We believe it is important to advance to have such kind of conversation in a more official and broader discussion. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed for raising these very, very important points. Indeed, there are issues that are very important to see how the same debate may generate sometimes different outcomes, and how it would be important sometimes to remind states of what they have already agreed upon. So thank you very much for this very, very clear presentation. I am now pleased to give the floor to Emile LeBrun. Emile is an expert on small arms control policy, and he is the founder of Kennis, Knowledge for Safety and Good Governance. And Emile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Anna, and thank you to the distinguished delegates from Italy and Mexico for hosting this side event. And to my colleagues from CROSS, WILP, and UNODA and UNODC. I'm pleased and grateful to be here representing Kennis, which is an international NGO based in the Netherlands, and which is a member of the Alliance. Toby, have you been able to share my slides? Great, I see them there. My comments comments I'll keep brief really reflect the perspective of an NGO working within the POA space and are designed to help enter a conversation with our colleagues who are experts in the firearms protocol and the ATT to identify some areas where those processes can learn from each other. It's a conversation I hope will continue after the BMS is finished and as the next meetings in the other instrument cycles convene. At the outset, let me make some scene-setting observations that may seem obvious, but which are relevant. The first is that the POA is a political agreement covering all member states, while the Firearms Protocol of the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the Arms Trade Treaty are legally binding instruments on those states that have adopted and ratified them. Some states in the POA process are not keen to hear about these other two instruments. In fact, states have not been able to agree to even referencing by name the Firearms Protocol and the ATT in the POA outcomes. And this was the case during RevCon 3 and in the working draft of the BMS 7 outcome. So there's some sensitivities in the POA community around this cross-referencing, but I don't think that should deter us from this discussion because this is a search for good and promising practices, something that we routinely do in our operational work in small arms control. And of course, we hope the discussion goes both ways and we can bring lessons from the POA process to the realm of the protocol and the ATT. Second, although these three instruments have some different unique modalities and focus areas, of course, they also have common ones. For example, manufacture, international transfers and brokering, and international cooperation and assistance, among others. More than that, all three instruments are ultimately concerned with reducing the human suffering caused by the illicit trade and the diversion of arms. As the BMS 7 chair said on Monday in reference to the POA, we are here to, quote, save the lives of innocent citizens. The focus on translating these instruments into action sometimes obscures their shared long-term humanitarian and development objectives, but it is this which gives the three agreements their full sense of complementarity. The third thing to say is that the work to operationalize the POA and to implement the Firearms Protocol and ATT is frequently done in the same national forums, and within the same bodies and by the same actors. So as we talk about learning from the different processes, we should not lose sight of the fact that there are strong common national platforms for integrating work to implement these instruments. It does not make sense, and in some states it's counterproductive to keep these efforts siloed. In fact, to some degree, synergy, to use the soft language of the draft BMS 7 outcome, is already happening. And this is occurring even at the global process level. For example, the theme of this year's Conference of State Parties for the ATT is preventing the illicit trade. This trend should only continue and be supported. Next slide, please, Toby. With these points in mind, let me turn to some reflections from the POA process and POA operationalization. Since the third review conference, a number of positive trends have emerged as member states have stretched the POA to cover aspects that have not always enjoyed consensus, including acknowledging that states use the POA framework to address ammunition, even if ammunition is not expressly covered by it, that different states are affected by the illicit trade problem in different ways and need the freedom to develop their own tailored priorities and targets towards which to focus action, that the phenomenon of armed violence is gendered and solutions must take this into account, as well as women's meaningful participation at all levels, and that the POA has underlying development objectives that should not be reserved only for the language with which we express concern about the illicit trade, but also the way that we measure our efforts or the suffering it generates. This stretching or flexibility is a hallmark of the POA process and gives it the possibility to remain current and relevant to emerging challenges. But it is often torturous and time-consuming, and the universal consensus model that's characterized the meeting process since outset has recently started to crack. One of the main discussion points within the community is whether this consensus model, in which outcome documents are pre-negotiated prior to and during the meetings, partly behind doors that are closed to NGOs, is an effective use of time. It's not an exaggeration to say that under the current process model, national reporting is registered rather than really assessed or interrogated, nor is national reporting analyzed systematically between the sessions as part of the official process. In fact, a fuller assessment of national reporting documenting operationalization of the POA has typically been left to NGOs. IANSA, UNIDIR, the Small Arms Survey, and others have produced fine-grained analysis of national reports over the last 20 years. This is essential for understanding where states are making progress and where there is stagnation. It's time-consuming and labor-intensive, and the last systematic study of this kind was conducted in 2018, although in recent years, much more information from the reports has been made available on the UN ODA POA portal. But one might rightly ask whether there is a way to make assessment of national reporting a more integral part of the POA meeting process. There is a strong feeling that doing so in a sensitive manner would spur more action. National reporting has fluctuated over the years, but is down from the peak in 2018. So new ideas and approaches to improve it are needed, because it's primarily through reporting that national action on POA operationalization is documented, and we will never reach those long-term humanitarian objectives without increasing action. Slide, please. Let me add a few comments about measurability. How will we know when we are making progress on the long-term development objectives of the POA and its companion instruments? In a sense, this is the most important question, certainly from the NGO perspective. Unfortunately, today, after 20 years of national efforts and BMSs and RevCons, we still do not have the tools and the data we need to make clear statements about impacts. We should not go another 20 years without making progress in being better able to do so. When the POA and the Firearms Protocol were agreed in 2001, we were in the era of the Millennium Development Goals, and the absence of a violence reduction component in the MDGs was noted by a number of concerned states at the time. The Geneva Declaration on Armed Violence and Development in 2006, which was a like-minded state initiative, was an important catalyst for remedying that gap. And with the arrival of the SDGs in 2015, there are now intelligible targets and indicators, both on violence and illicit arms flows. So we now have a framework for assessing how state action to operationalize the POA and implement the Firearms Protocol in ATT impacts the, quote, wide range of humanitarian and socioeconomic consequences of the illicit circulation of small arms, and the, quote, serious threat to peace, reconciliation, safety, security, stability, and sustainable development that they pose, as POA paragraph 2 put it back in 2001. It's therefore an achievement that the RevCon 3 outcome document speaks directly to the SDGs. However, up to now, references to the SDGs are either general or they focus on target 16.4 and its indicator 16.4.2 on illicit arms. But we should not lose sight of target 16.1 to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere, an expression of the foundational impulses of the POA, as well as the Firearms Protocol and the ATT. To summarize and conclude, the illicit arms trade challenge is enormous and multidimensional. It requires multiple approaches, including different instruments with different but mutually reinforcing requirements, obligations, and strategies. The process for each of the major instruments have much to learn from each other, and national efforts to implement them should become more synergistic. We should not forget that they also create separate reporting burdens on states that could be reduced by integrating reporting. Whether or not the BMS 7 outcome mentions the Firearms Protocol or the ATT by name, the framework for eventual impact assessments of implementation of all of them is rightly the SDGs, and it's heartening that the RevCon 3 and the draft BMS 7 outcome highlight this. In the future, specific references to target 16.1 should be included in the processes to help us measure, after 20 more years, if not long before, the further impacts of our collective efforts to reduce the human suffering inflicted with arms. Thank you for your attention. I'll turn the floor back over to the chair.
Thank you very much, Emile. Thank you for reminding us of the ultimate goal, something that has already been mentioned by previous speakers. And I think that it's very interesting to see that there is a sort of converging focus on the need to measure impacts in the broader term. And I'm also very grateful for the speakers to be very to stick to their time that allows us to continue in a very relaxed way. And I'm pleased now to turn to the co-organizer of this event, Professor Christian Ponti, who is a professor at the University of Milan and a member of the Observatory on Organized Crime, CROSS, that is jointly organizing with the Alliance this side event. And as Dr. Balsamo has mentioned before, Christian was also an expert panelist of the working group on firearms of the Conference of Parties to the UNTOC, the Vienna Convention on Transnational Organized Crime. So Christian, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Anna, and thank you to the distinguished delegates from Italy and Mexico for hosting this side event. Thank you especially to Antonio Balsamo for his kind words. In my presentation, I will try to provide a brief overview of the recently established review mechanism of the Firearm Protocol, supplementing the United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, HANTOC. After a description of the context in which the review mechanism was established, I will focus on its most significant features, especially with the purpose to shed light on its main innovation, its strengths and shortcomings, as well as its complementarities and potential synergies with other implementation processes on global small arm instruments. I will address this topic from the angle of international law, which is my expertise. As Antonio Balsamo already underlined, the Firearm Protocol is a crime control instrument. Unlike what happens under the Program of Action, by ratifying the Firearm Protocol, states parties assume a legal obligation to adopt measures necessary, including legislative and administrative one, to ensure its implementation. The non-fulfillment of such obligation by states party to the Firearm Protocol may amount to an international wrongful act, entailing the international responsibility of that state under customary international law. Core obligation upon states parties to the Firearm Protocol deal primarily with 4 areas, namely the establishment of criminal offenses related to illicit manufacturing and illicit firearm trafficking, authorization and licensing system for firearms, marking, record keeping, tracing of firearms, and cooperation. With the aim to facilitate its implementation, the institutional framework of the Firearm Protocol provides for a political and intergovernmental body, the Conference of the Party, or COP. The COP is convened every 2 years, and it essentially pursues 2 main goals, namely to improve the capacity of states parties to combat illicit firearm trafficking, for instance, by means of technical assistance, and to promote and review the implementation of the Firearm Protocol. During past 15 years, the COP and the Secretariat, UNODC, notwithstanding these enormous efforts, encountered several obstacles in driving the substantive aspect of the implementation process. Especially, the COP carried out a series of informal monitoring reporting activities based on self-assessment by states parties to the Firearm Protocol, with the aim to gather information on implementation. Completed questionnaires were submitted on periodic basis and were used by the Secretariat to compile analytical reports, which were presented to the COP during its session. Unfortunately, the COP achieved a very low response rate, and it was able to collect only rudimentary qualitative and quantitative information about the ongoing implementation process at national level. Officially, several explanations were given to the limited cooperation of states parties, including domestic technical problems in filling out the questionnaires, coordination problems between national authorities in collecting information, language barriers, and lack of human and financial resources. The establishment of an ad hoc treaty monitoring body early emerged within the COP as the only possible solution to overcome the difficulties of the reporting system and to lead states parties towards a more effective implementation and compliance with the Firearm Protocol. After extensive negotiation lasting more than 10 years, in October 2018, as Antonio Balsamo already underlined, the COP established the mechanism, which was finally launched last year. What is really new with the review mechanism. Alongside a general review that takes place in the plenary session of the COP, the review mechanism establishes country reviews, which consist first and foremost in a self-assessment evaluation. Unlike what happens within the context of the program of action, which foresees for a system of voluntary reporting on implementation, the review mechanism will provide in a period of 10 years for a mandatory mutual evaluation in different cycles of all relevant substantive provision of the Firearm Protocol, with the aim to review each thematic cluster of articles of the Firearm Protocol: criminalization, jurisdiction, prevention, law enforcement, and international cooperation. The states under review complete the relevant section of a self-assessment questionnaire on their implementation of the protocol. But why should we expect that the review mechanism will improve effectively the reporting system and more generally boost the implementation process of the Firearm Protocol? A first major innovation and a reason to be confident relies, in my view, on the fact that the review mechanism combines self-evaluation with peer review methodology, an absolute novelty within the context of the implementation processes on small arms. The review process, as Antonio Balsamo already pointed out, is carried out by two reviewing states parties with the active involvement of the state under review. This with the goal of helping the reviewed state to improve its policy making, adopt best practices, implement and comply with the Firearm Protocol. Each state, on a rotating basis, takes its turn as a reviewer and as a subject of a review. During this counter review, which will take place exclusively at distance through desk review, the peer review team analyzes the review state's responses to self-assessment questionnaire, and with the assistance of the Secretariat, which will provide administrative and technical support to facilitate the entire process, engage in a dialogue with the reviewed states. A second key innovation and one of the most prominent features of the review mechanism deals with the fact that the review mechanism will draft a final report in which the reviewing team is required to assess the performances of the state under review in implementing the Firearm Protocol. It is established that the review states, in close cooperation with the state party under review and with the assistance of the Secretariat, must prepare a list of observations indicating any gaps and challenges in the implementation of the provision under review, as well as, of course, best practices, suggestion, and any technical assistance needs identified to improve the implementation of the protocol. The country review report is made available to the working group on firearms and in governmental body of the COP that is convened every 2 years. The working group, which provides an important forum for exchanges view among firearm experts, submit its observation, including proposal for recommendation and technical assistance needs to the COP for its final decision. It is important to stress that this process will not produce any classification or ranking, and it aims to help states to build their own capacities for implementing the Firearm Protocol. I now turn to my concluding remarks. In my view, in year to come, and this is the first final comment, the operational functioning of the review mechanism will provide an excellent opportunity to effectively test the implementation of the Firearm Protocol provision into domestic legislation and their concrete enforcement by practitioners. The governmental and non-adversarial character of the review mechanism, combined with the educational function, that is to say the mutual learning of the peer review, are expected to facilitate acceptance and membership to the process, as well as dialogue and mutual trust between states parties to the protocol, but with the aim to maximizing the effectiveness of the implementation process. Transparency and inclusiveness should complement the evaluation. Unfortunately, although transparency is listed as the first guiding principle of the review mechanism, this requirement was vanished during negotiation of the conference, so that states parties may decide not to disclose all data submitted during the evaluation. Another challenge deals with the fact that although the legal architecture of the review mechanism provides formally for a role of civil society stakeholders, academia, NGOs, and private sector, both in the consultation and assessment phase, such roles should be strengthened and built during the practice of the review mechanism. These, in a way, potential limitations call on states party to show willingness and political commitment in supporting transparency and inclusiveness, with the aim to consolidate the legitimacy of the review mechanism. My second and last conclusion deals with some, in a way, desirable future scenarios that could maximize complementarities and synergies among different monitoring systems on small arms. For example, in middle term, the operational functioning of the review mechanism could significantly influence and persuade states parties to implement and comply with the Firearm Protocol more effectively through a mix of formal recommendations issued by the COP and informal dialogue between the peers and the Secretariat. This effect is known among a peer review system as peer pressure. That is to say, a kind of non-punitive modality to increase state accountability, in which reputation replaces sanction. One may hence wonder if the achievement of good performances in the functioning of the review mechanism could, for instance, indirectly contribute to increase the level of state accountability also within the context of other ongoing implementation processes of the Program of Action and Arms Trade Treaty. Indeed, both these processes had faced relevant declining rates and quality of reporting, as Emile LeBrun just pointed out in last years. Another synergy could be, in my view, envisaged as a possible long-term development of the ongoing implementation process under these different global implementation processes on small arms. According to these supposed future scenarios, which, by the way, would require a high level of commitment by states, while the BMS and review conferences of the Program of Action, as well as the COP of the Firearm Protocol, would characterize themselves as a fora to strengthen state accountability on implementation and compliance with small arm control instrument, the Conference of the Party of the ATT would instead provide a forum, for instance, to discuss and eventually sanction state responsibility in case of non-compliance with international standards on lawful small arm transfer. Thank you very much. I give you back the floor, Anna. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you for the overview of the recently adopted mechanism and highlighting more of the challenges, I would say. It is important to bring these issues to the attention of those who are involved in different aspects always related to firearms. And now we have Alison Pitluck. Alison, it's really my pleasure to give you the floor. You are Disarmament Program Manager at WILPF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And Alison is involved in the monitoring and analysis of various disarmament processes. So she can give us a bit of a comparative overview, but she can tell us especially about the ATT and what is happening in that area. Alison, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Anna, including for inviting me to join this event today. And thanks as well to Mexico and to Italy for their co-sponsorship of the side events. As Anna has said, I'm going to mainly be speaking about the Arms Trade Treaty, the ATT. And I want to say at the outset that I am aware of the positions of some UN member states toward the ATT. I'm also aware that the legal nature of the one instrument versus the politically binding nature of the other one may impact what is possible in terms of review mechanisms. So I would just offer that what I'm going to present is not necessarily meant to suggest that the ATT does things better. In fact, we have at times been critical, and you'll hear a bit of that today. But there are some good practices, and many of the structures that are set up could be instructive and informative. Our view is that the two instruments are very complementary, and so this is really intended as food for thought. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to begin with sort of a whirlwind and somewhat simplified scene setting tour of what the different implementation and review mechanisms the Arms Trade Treaty has, both formal and informal. And a good place to start is the treaty's reporting requirements. So some of you may recall that back in 2012 and 2013, when the Arms Trade Treaty was being negotiated, discussions about verification were very challenging and very complicated. And so the reporting and record-keeping provisions of the treaty were agreed to as a way of providing a measure with compliance. And there are two kinds of reports mandated by the ATT. First, an initial report, which states submit after acceding or ratifying, and this helps to set out what their relevant practice is at the time of joining the treaty, and these can be updated later on. And then there are also annual reports, which track mainly exports and imports. Both of these kinds of reports have voluntary templates. They are posted online, although states parties do have the option to request their report be kept private. And there are also record-keeping provisions found in the treaty. And this isn't on the slide, and I hadn't planned to mention it when I made the slide, but I do think it's worth noting that the treaty itself includes an article on amendments, which hasn't occurred or been proposed. It's probably very politically challenging, but the option is there. So a second thing to know about the ATT is to talk about its international meeting cycle. There are annual conferences of states parties, which take their mandate from the text of the treaty itself. Over time, the meeting cycle has come to include a rather robust intersessional program in which the three standing working groups of the ATT, which are on universalization, on transparency and reporting, and on implementation. And implementation also has a series of sub-working groups. These meet at least 2 times a year outside of their relevant sessions during the Conference of States Parties. And there are also at least 2 preparatory meetings for the CSP. And it's really been during these intersessional meetings where work has been progressed and advanced, and then usually any relevant decisions are presented at the CSP for adoption. And as well, over the last couple of years, many or most Conference of States Parties presidents have gotten into the habit of setting out a thematic focus for the annual conference, which can lead to and facilitate a lot of things that I will talk about shortly. There are also some civil society initiatives that I think are worth quickly mentioning because they provide various forms of informal and de facto monitoring, which overall helps to increase transparency. I've put a few examples up on the slide. This is, of course, not exhaustive of all that civil society does, but I do think it's important to mention it here. Similarly, there are also various assistance and support mechanisms which are maybe different than review, but because they do support implementation and some of them contain within them different various project reporting requirements, I also wanted to just put them up quickly on the slide. And I think we can probably move to the next slide. Thank you. Okay, so in all of this, what is good? What is maybe instructive or helpful for the POA context? First, I think that the working group system and having this very robust intersessional work program has, on balance, been beneficial. We've put forward some criticisms of some of the working group outputs at times that I will come to momentarily, but I do think that the structure itself really allows states parties, as well as other stakeholders who really want to engage on a particular aspect of the treaty, to do so in a more focused way than is ever really possible in an annual formal meeting. Sometimes the meetings can feel a little formal in that there are prepared statements being delivered, but in quite a lot of others, they are interactive. States parties are sometimes invited to provide presentations on their national practice. There's often, room for working papers, written inputs, and response to proposals, etc. And over time, the different working groups have produced some tangible outputs across all three of their different mandates. There have been different guides produced, voluntary guides. There has been the establishment of further subsidiary bodies. There has been a lot of work underway to update the reporting templates, as well as work to overcome the different challenges that some states parties are experiencing in meeting their reporting requirements. And the intersessional work approach, I think, helps to alleviate some of the pressure off of the annual meeting, as well as builds community and relationship because of the frequency of interaction. So for the POA, which does have somewhat infrequent meetings, I think this type of approach could be a helpful way to sustain momentum between the BMSs, as well as the review conferences, as well as to maybe make some progress in some very tangible and specific areas. To me, it reads like the suggestion for an open-ended technical expert group on the technology issue is very much in this vein. I'm aware that this idea is not universally supported, but maybe this kind of approach could be considered for other POA topics. A second thing that I think is helpful has been helpful rather for the ATT are the thematic areas of focus, because they've enabled a deep dive into very specific topics. Some of the themes over the years have been on the SDGs, on diversion, on gender and gender-based violence, on information sharing and exchange in relation to diversion, and finally this year on effective stockpile management. And what this looks like practically is that most CSP presidents put forward an informal working paper at some point to outline their thinking on the topic and suggest possible recommendations and decisions for states parties to take. These tend to be recommendations for national implementation, but can also be a way to really ground future work on the topic within the working groups or for future CSPs, for example. And then throughout the year, during the intersessional meetings, states parties as well as civil society have a chance to respond and react to that. There are often many side events and reports that correspond to the thematic topic happening in that cycle. So I think there's also this sort of inadvertent capacity and knowledge building that happens as an offshoot of this approach. And then finally, I think for the most part, the ATT structure is quite good for civil society input and access, which is a support to implementation and can also help with monitoring and review. So for instance, accredited civil society can inscribe to speak during any session of the annual CSP once states parties have finished. And this enables us to make more targeted and more precise interventions that correspond to the agenda item at hand, rather than trying to cover an entire meeting's worth of agenda points in one very time-limited statement. During intersessional meetings, it's not been uncommon to have presentations from technical or legal experts, especially in relation to matters that the working groups are considering. And again, there's a value in this because we're able to contribute in real time as recommendations are being formulated or work plans established, which I think mirrors better the real world role that many civil society organizations play within arms control. And I would also note that there is a lot of overlap between the non-governmental actors following all these different instruments that we're talking about today, whether it be from an advocacy, technical, or research perspective, which to me really reinforces their interconnectedness, particularly on a national and regional level. And then just quickly to say, though, it's not a perfect system, of course. To touch quickly on a few points of concern. I spoke in the beginning about reporting as being such an important monitoring tool for the Arms Trade Treaty. It is encountering issues of declining reporting rates, which is not an unfamiliar problem, I think. More reports are being kept private. There are challenges with the comparability of the data and the information that is provided. But work is being done to address some of these problems in really specific ways. And maybe some of the lessons learned from the work to improve ATT reporting could be helpful to reflect on in a POA context, not least where there is also substantive overlap in some of the content. And then we also have this kind of what I call the flavor of the month or the on to the next thing problem with the CSP thematic focus. There is, as I described, a lot of emphasis, resources, and interest put on a topic in 1 year, and that does lead to concrete actions, as I explained already. But then, when there is that move to the next topic in the next year, I think that if some of the action points or recommendations are maybe not well integrated into future work, then we lose sight of them. And so WILP and others have been encouraging a sort of stock-taking approach for future CSPs to do this kind of backward-looking assessment. And then finally, WILP and I think most others in civil society as well, and maybe a handful of states too, are very concerned about the avoidance and the lack of space available to address what we see as ongoing arms transfers of concern by ATT states parties, which we really see as an integral, if not the most integral part of assessing ATT implementation. There is a lot of time given over in meetings to other aspects of treaty implementation, many of which are very important. But this one aspect, which in our view gets to the heart of why there is an ATT, has been overlooked in the annual meetings and in the working groups. And I can appreciate that maybe this is not the kind of topic for a plenary discussion, so maybe we need to be creative. Maybe the mechanisms that Christian just described from the Firearms protocol could be something for the ATT community to consider. But I do think that over the long term, avoiding this becomes damaging to the treaty's credibility. So I'm going to stop there. Much of this I've outlined in an article that was published last year. For those who are truly keen, I can send it on to you. And I would just also offer up quickly that, the reality is that the issues of the illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons, or at least their impact, it is also being taken up in other non-arms control fora within the human rights community, within the women, peace, and security communities, some of whom have their own metrics and their own review mechanisms. And that too could present other opportunities for learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you also for the schematic approach that facilitates taking stock of what works and considering what works less positively. I think that some of this perhaps may be picked up and continuing in a comparative way if we have time in the discussion later on. But now we want to hear the voice of the Secretariat. We want to hear what UNODA, and we have the privilege of having Katia Butcher here, Political Affairs Officer at the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, and she is the key person now, focal point for BMS 7. So we are really grateful that she could find the time to be with us today. So Katia, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna, and hello to everybody from New York, from literally the midst of BMS 7, where we're just having the lunch break. Thank you so much for organizing this side event where, I can also still learn about the different details of all the review processes and monitoring and evaluation frameworks which are ongoing. So I'll just give you a couple of points from the POA perspective, also keeping in mind, that some of the things are something the Secretariat has proposed, and some of the things are also something member states have adopted in outcome documents. So the POA, as probably most of you know, have an established review conference, which takes place every 6 years. So we had the third review conference, which took place in 2018, and then every 2 years we have a biannual meeting. So we have usually 2 biannual meetings and then the review conference, which they both have a very similar mandate. They actually are considering and reviewing respectively the implementation of the program of action and also of the international tracing instrument. And I think member states do, however, feel that the BMS meetings are sort of narrow and focus on the implementation, while the review conferences are the platform to also address some of the new challenges. Nevertheless, of course, some of these issues do come up, more frequently than every 6 years. So they also are on the agenda of the BMS meetings. And then in between, we had 2 meeting of governmental experts in the POA processes. So Alison also just suggested the open-ended working group, which is currently in the draft. If member states agree to that, at the end of the week, would establish an open-ended working group, more of a technical nature, which would develop some, or which could develop some recommendations on how to address the issue of new technologies. That would be the first in the POA process. This is really also a kind of in-between step for the first time, where states are discussing indeed such a working group, because they're not quite ready to take the next steps, and they want this to be an all-inclusive member state-driven process. So they are considering that. It might also come down to, what are financial implications? What is a good time frame to establish something like this? What are, how broad or how narrow is the mandate, and when will it report back? The current formulation says to establish such a working group and then to report back to the review conference, which would be in 2024. And then member states could take up the recommendations of such an open-ended working group. Apart from the meetings, of course, the process itself is a little bit different, I think, to what we've heard, in the ATT context, in the Firearms Protocol context. The POA is for all UN member states and is owned by all UN member states and is a consensus-based process. There was voting, as was already rightly pointed out, in 2018. Nevertheless, the aim remains to have a consensus-based outcome document. That really means that at the end of some of these meetings, the progress perhaps is a little bit lower than is possible in some of the other frameworks, because you have to, or ideally you bring along all member states, because this is really the universal framework for that. The POA and the ITI do have a reporting requirement, and indeed it's of voluntary nature for the program of action, but it's not of voluntary nature for the international tracing instrument, and those two are part of the same reporting mechanism. What was also pointed out by Emile is that these reports are not frequently analyzed, at least not in the UN framework. Member states did not want that. However, in 2018, the Secretariat has received a mandate to analyze the reports and other information they have received and to make a presentation at all the POA meetings. This will be done this afternoon, actually, when we resume the meeting at 3 o'clock, so in about half an hour. The Secretariat will present on the opportunities and challenges it identified from information which was received, which of course includes the reports. And I do also think that the transparent nature of the reports, while they are not complete and not everybody reports, but every single report received under the POA and the ITI is publicly available. And therefore accessible, and we do also stress that they are important instruments for channeling assistance, for example, because states are able in those reports to identify those areas where they do need assistance, which I think is a key part. And also the reports are a living document. And this is, I think, something which probably we haven't heard, and I'm not familiar with how this works in the other frameworks, but the POA reporting template is adapted to the outcomes of each of these either review conferences or biannual meetings. And for example, in 2016, the Secretariat added a specific section on gender-related reporting, which has expanded in 2018, and that really reflects the progress states make. And then they can also report on that, and that's perhaps something important to also take away. Very briefly, I think implementation is the other part of what you're obviously reviewing. There is developed by the UN the mosaic modules, which really translate not only the program of action, but also the Arms Trade Treaty, also the Firearms Protocol into practice. So this includes how you establish national action plans and And most countries have national action plans which reflect to which which treaties they are a party, in addition to the POA and the ITI. And I think that's important to note that these synergies do exist indeed, and they are also reflected in that guidance. We also have a new Mosaic module which is on monitoring evaluation specifically, because if we want a strong review process, we also need to ensure that states are actually able to monitor and evaluate what they had put in place as their plans. And we see that increasingly happening, for example, with regional roadmaps, where they are very specific on, targets and indicators, and the data collection aspect, which I think is a great addition to something which the POA does not offer, which is some kind of measurability and time frame. And just maybe to share before I conclude, that in 2018, the UN Secretariat in the POA framework had proposed to states to consider whether voluntary national and regional targets could be something states wish to endorse. The initial proposal was to also make the biannual meeting of states a little bit more tangible. And there we were specifically looking also, for example, at climate change processes where something like this is already done, but also at the mine action process where, for example, there's more expert roundtables, also part of some of those meetings. States decided that they want to continue with the political negotiations of the outcome document. However, in the current draft outcome document of BMS7, states have reflected that they do wish to have the voluntary target setting included in addition to the political process. So perhaps this is something where going forward, this idea gets taken up, and we can really see more national ownership and regional ownership through those targets, which states can set, and then they can set them, to implement the POA. But of course, they can also extend that to other frameworks, and then they can report specifically on those priorities. Doesn't mean that they don't implement the POA as a whole, but I think it really enables them to crystallize some of their priorities, and then assistance could also be channeled to those priorities. So it's more of a bottom-up approach than a top-down approach. And I will stop here with this. So this is maybe something to just look out for in the negotiations over the next 2 days. Thank you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Katia. Thank you. Also, very clear what we can expect and how to also how to take stock of this program of action that has a sort of long history of review, and may represent a model to which all countries can relate, considering that it's of a global nature. So all these reflections are very important to be taken into account. We have now exhausted our list of speakers, but we have been lucky, and we have found Simonetta Grassi, who is the head of the Global Program on Firearms of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, that is the Secretariat to the Firearms Protocol, basically to the UN Convention on Transnational Organized Crime and the Protocol, and she is also the Secretary of the Working Group on Firearms. And so we're lucky to hear a comment from her before starting the discussion. Simonetta, please.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you also for inviting me. As you say, I'm speaking in my dual capacity as, on the one hand, the Secretary of the Working Group on Firearms, but also as the head of the Global Firearms Program, which is basically the vehicle through which UNODC provides technical legislative assistance to member states to implement the Firearms Protocol and the Parent Convention against Transnational Organized Crime. I will be brief because I have the benefit of being the last one to speak. I have heard a lot of very, very interesting comments and observations, And I would like to thank all the speakers because I have really heard lots of relevant inputs and views and with regard to the different review processes, their strengths, their weaknesses, but also the potential for synergies. And I think this is, I think, the crucial point, because we speak of a complex framework when it comes to small arms and light weapons, firearms. There is a complex framework in place, and we would be naive if we ignored the existence of the other instruments, because these are all, we always used to say that the program of action, the international tracing instrument, the firearms protocol, but also the arms trade treaty and the regional instruments, they form complementary building blocks. And as such, I think that also the review mechanisms or the mechanisms that have been adopted by member states with regard to each of these different processes and instruments can somehow influence each other or can benefit from each other. So I have just a few quick observations to make, and I want just to complement what was already said by Mr. Antonio Balsamo and by Professor Ponti about specifically the review mechanism for the firearms protocol, but also what was said by other speakers. And I would just like to highlight a few points. The first is, I totally agree with Christian that the strength of the review mechanism is that it combines a peer process with a self-assessment, and it forces countries, state parties. So in that sense, it's more limited because it's only the state parties. And when it comes to the protocol, we speak of 120 state parties. We don't have yet universal adherence, but it creates, on the one hand, stronger ownership, but also responsibility, because every country will have to establish a team of experts that are knowledgeable about the process, the instruments, the convention, the protocols, etc., and will have the ability to engage with the other team of the country, of reviewing country. And this allows for a lot of cross-fertilization, which will show its result not immediately, but I would say in the coming years, as the reviewing teams will engage with each other and will engage in an active, constructive dialogue. Another issue that I would like to highlight as a strength is the role of the working group on firearms, because in the negotiation of this mechanism, what was agreed is that the respective working group on the convention, there is a working group on technical assistance, the working group on the firearms protocol, the protocol on human trafficking, the protocol on smuggling of migrants, will have to play a role in reviewing the list of observations, the reports that will be submitted periodically to the working group on the status of implementation. But the working group has also a dual role, because in addition to this, what was agreed in the negotiation process is that the working group should not stop to perform its ordinary functions, to be a platform for practitioners in the first place to meet, to exchange views, best practices, challenges, not only on the individual provisions of the protocol, but also on related matters. So in a way, to keep abreast of what is going on. And that's very important, because that will assure us, I think, that the review mechanism will not take place in a bubble. It will be also influenced in a way by the continuous discussions that will continue in the working group, because what was agreed is that there will be at least 2 agenda items. One will focus on the findings of the review mechanism, but there will always be another substantive agenda item that member states will agree upon, that will allow the working group to continue to engage. And this will also give a potential possibility, for example, to address synergies with other mechanisms. Or, for example, this year we had the working group that addressed 2 important issues: the links between illicit financial and illicit arms flows, which is extremely important when we look at the SDG 16.4, which identify these 2 goals in one goal, in the 16.4. And we also addressed diversion, firearms trafficking, and diversion in arms transfers. So these are topics that are not addressed only in the context of the firearms protocol, but the working group allows to stretch out and to establish these type of synergies. So this is, I think, something that is important because the working group will support the review mechanism, but will continue to have its own life at the same time, and that will allow us to not be in a bubble, but to continue. Something that I see a little bit as a downside is the fact that before we had the review mechanism, which took 10 years to be finally negotiated and agreed, there was an information gathering process based on self-assessment questionnaires. And this has now been replaced. Now, the mechanism will be extended over different phases, so it will take 10 years to be completed. It will be important for member states, in my very personal view, to keep the momentum to ensure that there will be also a regular periodic update of the information that member states will provide in the first, in the second, in the third round, so that after 5 years, after 6 years, we will not forget what was reported in the first year and what the progress will be in the meantime. So I think the continuous periodic update on information on progress made by member states will be something that I think will have to be figured out and will be very important. Another downside, in my view, but that's also reason why it took 10 years to negotiate the process, is the fact that it is entirely funded from extra budgetary resources. This puts a big question mark on the process. It will really depend on the goodwill of member states that support the process for it to take place. And I mean, it will take place anyhow among reviewing countries, but the supportive role that the Secretariat will be able to provide will depend on extra budgetary resources, as much as, and I think this is an important point that we should not underestimate. And last but not least, the role of civil society organizations could have been stronger. And I think I'm looking at Anna, who is on the screen, but I look at all other civil society organizations that are very much engaged. Because of UNODC's specific mandate in the area of crime prevention and criminal justice, there is not this big wealth of community. So I think it's really important to engage with civil society and to exploit their role as much as possible. And that was one of the bones of contention in the negotiation process. So therefore, what we have is maybe not the very best. I don't know what Anna and other representatives from civil society think, but it is a very good starting point. And with this, I will stop because I know that maybe there will be more discussions. And I'm looking forward to these exchanges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simonetta, and thank you also for bringing us civil society into the picture again. Indeed, it could have been stronger, the mandate for civil society, the role of civil society in the review mechanism in Vienna. But as you say, it's a starting point. And of course, we are very happy to start building this type of bridges. So bridging the Vienna community with the New York community, trying to create some dialogue about review mechanisms that can be taken forward. So we have exactly 6 minutes. Is there anyone who wants to ask a question? I'm also asking Tobias to help me because I'm not very good at seeing raised hands. Anyone who wants to ask a question? I think, is there anyone in the chat?
David Atwood, Anna.
Yes.
Okay, David Atwood. Thank you. David, please, the floor is yours. David.
I'm always failing to unmute. Thanks very much to all of the to the organizers and the speakers for this most interesting and timely conversation, which I think has produced many, many excellent ideas and highlighted many processes which are positive steps in improving what these instruments are intended to do. I just ask one question very quickly, even though there have been many elements pointed out by people, but beyond this conversation, and Anna, you've just sort of suggested that we should go forward from here, but what specific kinds of steps would help to keep this conversation going? And also, what are some of the key roadblocks that we can anticipate as we try to do this? There's always possibilities of having more meetings and more discussions and more things that cost money. And you can anticipate all of the reactions to that. On the other hand, if this really is an opportunity to bring these processes together in some constructive way, in the end, that ought to save money and time and energy, and the output should be overall be better. But is there what would be the next, say, next 2 or 3 key steps that might help this process to move on and this conversation to continue? Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Great point. You said it. You said it well. We want to continue definitely. How it's a bit of an issue, because also Simonetta correctly raised the issue of money. Obviously, money is a very important element. Unfortunately, during the pandemic, we have learned to use these platforms and to meet virtually. We hope there will be the possibility for face-to-face meetings, more frequent and more interactive. We have one. It's not really a question, but it is a statement in the chat, and I think it is supporting the role of civil society in making claims before national courts and tribunals. And it is a very important aspect that we consider. And I think we can very quickly ask the 2 representatives from member states if they have something to tell us about how their countries could receive the recommendations, the sort of recommendations that have been made during this discussion. So I don't know, Isaac, Antonio, who would like to respond? Isaac.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for also all panelists, and thank you for the questions, key questions. I will share from our point of view, from the point of view of Mexico, 2 elements. One, from the international, from the multilateral setting. I believe a kind of next step to keep this conversation and to find ways to better implement will be trying to accommodate as much as we can conversations between and among governing bodies of each of the instruments and secretariats of each of the instruments. I refer in my presentation to the very first exercise that we did chairing the CIFTA, I mean the regional instrument, asking governing bodies and secretariats to come and to discuss what we can do at the ground level, at the day-by-day work of each of these governing bodies and secretariats to advance what we have called synergies in general. It was very productive discussion, and I sincerely believe that we need more of these conversations. Just to share with you, Mexico have shared recently the UNTOC working group on firearms, and thanks also to Simonetta to put the issue of synergies in the core discussion of this working group. And actually, we find again a possible setting to have this continuation of dialogue. The other element is at the national or at the regional level. And in this, I will say that now we agree, we actually have agreed that we do have the instruments, we do have the tools. Then we need to better implement what we previously agreed on. And to improve the way to implement, it is necessary to launch a process of identification of what we haven't implemented yet. And then to try to identify ways to be persuasive, if I may say, of the benefits of this implementation at the national level, between our national authorities, with our national authorities, and then elevating these experiences and share these experiences at regional and international levels. And I'm not talking about the intergovernmental process, of course, but also from the benefits that you from civil society and academia have found of advancing the implementation of some contents of the instruments that we haven't implemented yet. I believe, and I finish with this, that synergies exist indeed on the ground level, and it will be also important to take into account what my colleagues said on the opportunity that the framework of the SDGs give us to show and to make more visible these synergies that at the ground level exist. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. So unfortunately, our time is really finished, and the plenary is about to start in 10 minutes. So we cannot really continue much. We would just like to thank everyone. And I think we are going to meet again. So we will continue this conversation. We are extremely grateful to Italy and Mexico, and to all the speakers for contributing from different points of view and different angles to creating a puzzle that starts becoming visible and very clear. And I think that we can find a role for everyone, and the important thing is to keep working so that we can really contribute meaningfully to advancing this. The materials that have been presented today, with the permission of the speakers, are going to be shared on the website of the Alliance. So please come back, and you will be able to download the presentations. Thank you again. I wish to wish you an excellent continuation of the discussions in the BMS for those who are involved, and those of us who will be following remotely will look from a distance and waiting to come back in person to New York. Thank you, everybody. Bye. Bye-bye.